Alright folks, so welcome back. It's Siberian, and in today's video I'm going over this kit that you see in front of me today. Now this is the Weapon R header kit that comes for the Sentra base, which is the 2.0 or the 2-liter Sentra. And what you can see, and basically there's two pieces to it, but it is a 4x2x1 kit. So you have, obviously each one of the runners for the exhaust, which then combine from the 4 pipes into the 2, and then the 2 go into this, which is where your catalytic converter normally sits, and then goes into the 1 and then out to your catback exhaust. Now, unless you have the actual main Sentra header from the stock engine in place, you won't actually see just how restrictive it is. But one thing to keep in mind is that when you look at the stock Sentra header, these pieces right here are significantly slimmer. And when I say significantly, I mean by quite a bit, and they also bend at a really strange angle, so as opposed to having this really nice kind of, all-around bend to them, they kind of go at an almost like 90 or 85 degree angle, which is really odd. And then of course, instead of having, a collector that's basically these 4x2, it's more of a 4x1 immediately, which means obviously the scavenging effects are not working nearly as well, and in general you're just not getting as good of a performance because the flow is a lot worse. So with this, again, the pipes are all same size, so you've got, all the power that you can possibly get out of this thing, helping you extract the most out of your engine. And then of course, this part right here, where you're typically having your catalytic converter sit, now instead you have basically an open pipe. And then that goes obviously straight back into the catback exhaust or what have you on your car, and again improves performance from there on. Now, I have not put this thing on, even though I've had it at my house for about, I want to say like 4 months now. And the reason for that is because I was actually waiting on the Yanaka exhaust for my car. Now the Yanaka exhaust I finally installed after basically quite a bit of trouble figuring out how the hangers work and how you're supposed to take them off, and then figuring out that my exhaust scraped because I couldn't get the rear part of the catback to actually align properly. I finally got that done this past weekend, where I was able to basically jack it up and out of the way and actually put the exhaust stays that were in place there before, and I kind of wrapped them with some exhaust wrap to prevent it from basically hitting against the exhaust stay. That way it doesn't rattle around, because it is kind of a loud exhaust. When you really get on it, it starts to kind of move around quite a bit. But with this particular kit, I'm not sure if I'll be doing the header exhaust itself on my own, mainly because there's so many pieces kind of to this that you don't have to do with the just regular catback install. And even the catback took me about 6 hours because I was a noob, had no clue which parts needed to come out first. A bunch of the hangers took quite forever to figure out how to take them off. And then, like I said, I've been still troubleshooting a bunch of stuff. And the donut gasket, the part that actually goes on this part of the exhaust in the stock, didn't fit into my Yanaka catback, so I had to get a separate part, which meant, getting under the car again, replacing that, and it still doesn't really fit the greatest, so I might, potentially have a shop do this install and then change out the gasket for me so that I have that all sealed up properly, because I still have a bit of a leak going on there. Now, this particular exhaust is not really street legal. There are counties in California where you can register the car with this exhaust, which is basically kind of my plan for this thing, because I do want to keep it on the car at all times without having to kind of take it off every time I have to go in for smog. But something else is that I had to actually get an extension for the O2 sensor mount, because if you just run this with the O2 sensor in here the way that it is, you end up getting a check engine light, puts the car into kind of limp mode, and basically you don't want that happening to you. Lose a bunch of power, car doesn't run properly, all that kind of stuff. Now, one thing that does kind of suck about this exhaust is that on the stock Sentra, you actually have this part, which is the sort of, I guess it's the upstream O2 sensor. This one is in a different location, so I'm not sure if I'm going to need to potentially extend the wires on it or something along those lines, because the location for this piece is different on the stock car versus this guy. So that's kind of the one issue that I already kind of foresee with this. Potentially, so that might be sort of bad. But we'll see how it goes. In terms of weight, I'm not sure how much lighter this is. I haven't had the stock header off just yet. I would imagine that this piece might potentially be around the same weight, because this piece is definitely quite heavy, but then you lose the catalytic converter, which obviously has, you know, all those cells in there. So potentially it might be lighter, or it might be the same weight. I don't think it's heavier, but if you're somebody that's interested in that kind of stuff, then, you know, that's a different story at that point. But for me, you know, it's mostly about the performance and about the sound and getting as much out of the car as possible. Now, the reason why I ended up going with this, and you might think, oh, you know, why are you doing a full exhaust on a crappy 2-liter, especially the MR20DE? And the reason is, I still have quite a few plans for this car. So, for those of you who have been following my videos from a while back, I'm still planning on doing the ITBs for this car. So they're going to be from a BMW Superbike. They're 48mm ITBs, so they're fairly large in size. Not the biggest, but you know, they are what they are in terms of sizing, and they should do plenty to supply the car with the proper amount of air. The issue there is that I still need to create a proper mount for them. So basically the gasket that actually attaches to the air intakes needs to be created basically from scratch to mount to the ITBs, and then I also need to redo the car's stock airbox. The reason the stock airbox needs to be redone is because if I still want to be able to run the car on the street and not throw a bunch of codes and not have to do like a fancy ECU reflash, which would, you know, potentially cost hundreds of dollars, and you know, depending on how I run it, I may need to have that off and on, or have to buy a reprogrammer, and it just basically goes down this whole rabbit hole of, you know, what do you really want to do with the car. Now eventually when I do track the car and make it kind of a full track car, that's not going to be a problem, but for now, since it's my daily driver, I want to make sure that everything's kind of up to, you know, up to spec. And so with that said, you know, I can't just be going around constantly changing the shifter codes on this thing for the ECU. And so with this kit, you know, I'm able to kind of have all of that mounted up properly, but then when I have the air intake on here, I'll need to still keep the EGR valves, all the vacuum hosing needs to be in place. So basically all of the stock pieces that would connect to the stock intake manifold and intake airbox, those all need to be in place, and hence why the need for that airbox, and also to basically keep the ITBs filtered so that I have a way to, you know, have just a single filter as opposed to a filter on each individual throttle body. That way I'm able to keep clean air going into the engine without having any sort of dirt, grime, or other small particles. And, you know, last but not least, the car is going to be running a Phantom supercharger, electric supercharger, so that'll be mated directly to the airbox, then feeding into the ITBs, and then going through this system with the Weapon R headers, and then the Yonaka exhaust. It's a 2.5 inch exhaust. Now, you know, ideally people suggest that for power situation you should really want to use like a 3-inch exhaust, but you know, I don't really see this car making that much power, so I think 2.5 is perfectly fine until then. And the fact of the matter is that this thing is actually 2.5 as well, so it should mate to the Yonaka really well without really any major kind of issues in as far as that's concerned. So everything should mate pretty well and produce decent power numbers out of this car as it stands. Now later on down the road, another potential that I want to do is to actually build the CVT. Now, a lot of people have said that you can't build a CVT. I've taken a look at a bunch of YouTube videos for people kind of taking a look at this stuff. One of the people that said you can't build the CVT are the guys at, I believe it was like Speed Academy. They did the Insane Juke and a bunch of other kind of turbo jukes, and they've built their own, you know, kind of exhaust systems with the turbo built into them. And they said that basically the only thing you can do is put a cooler on the CVT, which is, you know, definitely one of the things that I'll be doing with the Sentra as it starts making more power. But there's something else that I found out from another YouTube channel, and I can't recall the name of it now. But basically they said that the problem is you have these, you know, kind of pulley systems in the CVT which pull apart and then come together, and they have this channel on the inner pulley system where the second pulley slides in, and they have bearings in there. And so the problem that happens is over time, because they use really crappy metals on these two pulleys, eventually they just kind of basically mess up the grooves that are in there, and the reason the grooves get messed up is because the bearings go, because the bearings are low quality, and when the bearings go, the metal basically just kind of scrapes and then cracks right along the ridge where the bearings sit, so you end up having these pulleys that are no longer able to compress and basically decompress, which means that the transmission is not working at all as it should, and then you end up having problems where the belt basically snaps and just comes off. And so the plan is to see if I can get a used transmission, hopefully low mileage, that's also a CVT from my model year of a car, take it apart, take these pulleys out, 3D scan them, and then have them ideally either milled or 3D printed out of like titanium or something along those lines that's a significantly stronger alloy than what they used. So that will allow for much beefier components within the CVT. Also, I'd want to upgrade the bearings to something really heavy duty. That way they are able to handle the power that this car will eventually be putting out as well, and be able to do it consistently, even if I don't reach the sort of power levels that that I want to do in this car. But ideally, it would make the transmission last a lot longer. And last but not least, since the engine is going to be making more torque, it's going to need a new belt. And it just so happens that Bosch actually makes a belt system for these push belt CVTs that is able to handle a lot more torque than the belt that's stock in this car. If that doesn't work out, I'm potentially thinking about salvaging the belt from either the Juke or the Nissan. I want to say it's the Maxima, because they actually have the 2.5 liter engine, which does make more torque and more power, or potentially the Nismo as well, or not the Nismo, I apologize, the Nissan Murano, since they have a CVT in that as well, and that one has a much more sturdy belt to be able to handle the extra torque of these engines. So there's some options there, but the idea is that I would be able to take sort of all these components, put them together, and have a car that, hopefully by the time I'm done with this, is able to reach somewhere in the 300 horsepower range. It has been said online that this car is capable, or this block I should say, is capable of handling, at around 500 horsepower. Personally, I think that's kind of pushing it. Yes, you can do the bottom end, you can do the crank, you can do the connecting rods and all that stuff, and make them out of a billet metal or something that's a lot stronger. You can have them forged, all this stuff made out of titanium, but your limiting factor is always going to be the block in that situation, and since it's a cast aluminum block, I'm not really sure how much horsepower it can actually take. Now, as far as I know, the sleeves in this engine are iron, so potentially they might be able to handle some amount of power, but I wouldn't imagine that anything past 400 is any kind of good for this block. I'd imagine that over time, as you kind of stress the the block components with the heat and the extra power that you're making, it'll probably crack, because it was basically just never designed for this sort of power level, and obviously they never used it in they never used this engine in any other racing or any other kind of developments where this thing would have actually made like a decent chunk of power. But with that said, when you consider the fact that you've got these sort of systems out there in place that are able to make the car faster, this is a good way forward for this engine. Eventually, unless I sell the car, my plan is to also see about potentially just cutting the chassis back and getting basically like a body kit onto the car. Ideally something out of carbon fiber, so that all I have left is basically just the steel base and then the carbon fiber on top of that. That way, I've got a lower center of gravity, move the engine to the back, and basically, still run this header system, but then just have a really short exhaust coming out into the back, and that way, paired with a limited slip diff in the back, I can have a pretty decent performing car. Now, people would probably say, oh, this is crazy, whatever you're doing right now is already pretty crazy, but, I think that this platform has quite a bit of potential. I find this car to be quite a bit of fun to drive. I've, had a great time with it. It's a really little car, handles superbly once you get some good pieces of, kit on there, especially suspension-wise. I've been really happy with my D2 suspension, so I think adding this extra, kind of bit to help it gain just that, tiny little bit of extra power is going to be great. Obviously, until I get like a better tune on the car, none of this is really going to matter too much. For the most part, I don't think the computer in the car as it is stock is going to be able to adjust for all these changes in components. But with that said, that's kind of the way forward for the time being. I think that when I end up doing the turbo, I may also end up doing the fuel pump for the car as well, just so that I can have a little bit of extra flow through the injectors. Whether or not the injectors can handle the extra flow is something else that has to be determined. I'm hoping that I can stay away from buying new injectors for the car, but we'll see. The idea would be, because this turbo only maxes out at something like 6 psi, it's a very low level of boost. Should be plenty, in terms of what this engine, this block can handle without having to do anything to the bottom end, or the top end for that matter. Down the road, potentially, I might end up doing cams. We'll kind of see. I do kind of like the way the car performs right now. And something else is that, for the most part, all of these mods are kind of really just adding to the top end of the car more than they are the bottom end, and I kind of prefer having a little bit more torque with this motor, but we'll see, kind of which way things end up going. With that said, this Weapon R system is absolutely gorgeous. It's a really great looking piece of kit. I'm actually really disappointed that Nissan didn't do kind of like a performance version of the Sentra, but this is a kind of factory mod that you could have on this vehicle, because I really think it's it's just a really awesome way to extract a little bit of extra juice out of this car. And so hopefully, you guys, the next time that I do this video, I'll be able to have at the very least this piece on the car. Potentially looking at also putting the 2J racing pulley, lightweight crankshaft racing pulley, on the car, so that should be able to make the car rev a little bit faster. As I kind of start adding all these components in, the car should start coming together, and then hopefully I end up doing some kind of autocross event or something with all these pieces in place, and we'll go from there. So I'll keep everyone updated. I am still working on the ITBs and on the airbox for this car, so don't fret. The project is not dead. It's just taking a while because I've kind of had a bunch of other stuff that I've been having to do first before I'm kind of able to get to that stage with the vehicle as it is right now. So slowly and surely pieces are kind of coming together, and as I get this more built out, I'll kind of give you guys the rundown of what I've done, what things I've had to do to get the car running as well as it is, and we'll go from there. So I'll see you gents in the next video.